every day, late at night, not okay. All I want, and I pray, all I need are some better.
In this lecture, we are going to talk about the stakeholder engagement process. One thing that's important to know for this lecture is up until this point in the course, when we've used the term stakeholder, we've been referring almost exclusively to people within your organization. And so what level of leadership do you need to get involved? What are the different organizations such as privacy, legal, cyber, procurement, etc. that need to be involved? And we've done that with the intention of making sure that our development, our deployment, etc., this is a very smooth process and that we have the internal structures in place to support an AI system throughout its life cycle. With regards to this lecture, all of that still applies. Also, I want you to think about stakeholders outside of your organization, specifically the communities that may be impacted by the system that you're developing and will be deploying. We're going to start by explaining the purpose for having a stakeholder engagement process. I will then outline what that process is. We're going to look at questions to evaluate salience or importance of different stakeholder groups. We're then going to look at a positionality exercise. So we will define what positionality is and then look at positionality reflection. We're then going to look at a chart that will help to determine the different engagement levels of the various stakeholders. We will then conclude with different methods of stakeholder engagement and close with those engagement method examples. There are a few reasons why we want to have a stakeholder engagement process. It helps to identify the relevant stakeholders, again, not just internally, but externally. It helps to facilitate rights holder involvement and input throughout the project, to identify and safeguard equities, and finally, to establish revisitation and evaluation cadence. So what is a stakeholder engagement process? It is the process of evaluating stakeholder salience or relevance, who is important and how involved do they need to be. Also included in this process is performing a positionality exercise, which we will define later, determining levels of engagement, and finally establishing engagement methods. Now remember, we're not talking just about internal stakeholders, but external as well. Some questions for you and your organization to consider with regards to determining stakeholder salience are: who has existing interests in the project? Who will be impacted? Who will benefit the most? Who is the most and least powerful? Who has existing influence within the domain in which the system will be deployed? Whose influence is limited? Whose rights may be impacted? And who has protected and contextually vulnerable characteristics? We're now going to start talking about a positionality exercise. This is a term that is in the body of knowledge, and you therefore need to understand it in case a question pops up on your exam. What does positionality mean? Positionality is the social and political context that creates your identity and influences your understanding of the world. A positionality exercise identifies how the 4 categories listed below here represent sources of power and advantage or sources of marginalization and disadvantage. And the 4 categories to consider during the positionality exercise are personal characteristics and group identifications, socioeconomic status, education, training, and work background, and institutional frame and team composition. The image that you see here is for a positionality reflection. And so once you know what the term positionality means, now you can start asking questions about yourself, about the group that you work with, your organization, or bigger institutions. And the answers to these questions will help you with the positionality reflection questions that we're going to look at on the next slide. I'm not going to read through all of this here. You can pause the video and read through this on your own. I think it's very unlikely that you're going to be tested on this content. With that said, it's important that you know what positionality is, You understand the importance of a positionality reflection or process in the stakeholder engagement process, especially when it comes to working with the public. But I don't think that you're going to be tested on the content that you see here. Once you've worked through the questions that we looked at in the previous slide, you want to engage in what's called a positionality reflection. And here are a few questions that would help you with that. How does the positionality of the team, again, this being the AI development or governance team, relate to that of the affected rights holders and other stakeholders? And so, again, just to provide a little bit more context here, think about the AI system development or governance team. What is their positionality? And how does that relate to the folks who are actually going to be using and engaging with the system? The second question, are there ways that your position as a team member could lead you to choose one option over another when assessing risks? And finally, what, if any, missing stakeholder viewpoints would strengthen your team's assessment of this system's potential impact on human rights and fundamental freedoms? Once you've completed the positionality reflection, you want to determine the engagement level. We want to define clear and explicit participation objectives. These include determining why you are engaging with stakeholders, what is the purpose of the engagement, what are the expected outcomes, and what level of influence will stakeholders have on processes and outcomes. When I saw this chart for the very first time, it made me think of a RACI chart. I think that's how they're pronounced, RACI, which is responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. Two of those features are here, consult and inform, but the top two here are empower and partner as opposed to responsible and accountable. You don't need to worry about the RACI chart for the AIGP exam. And again, I don't think you're going to be tested on this specific content, but I do feel that this is a really helpful tool for any AI governance professional, right? This is going to make sure that you have a 360-degree view of the development process, of engaging stakeholders, etc. I'm not going to read through all of this, but you can understand it starting at the top with empower. These are stakeholders who are engaged as decision makers and are expected to gather pertinent information to be proactive in co-production. So we have the degree of participation, the means of participation, and the level of agency. Agency here being human agency, right? How much control do they actually have over this process? And so stakeholders, whether again, this is an individual or this is an organization, they're going to have participation and empowerment at the empower level. When we step down to partner and then consult and then inform, their degree of participation, their means of participation, and their level of agency is going to decrease. Again, I'm not going to read through all of this here. You're, of course, welcome to hit pause and scan over this on your own. Once you have determined the level of stakeholder engagement, you want to establish the engagement methods. How are you going to be communicating with all of these different stakeholders? And again, depending on their level of empowerment, as we just saw in the previous slide, the engagement methods may vary. Two factors to consider with regards to engagement methods: the evaluation and accommodation of stakeholder needs, and finally, practical considerations of resources, capacities, timeframes, and logistics. There are a number of different engagement methods. These include newsletters, regular emails, letters via snail mail, community posts, app notifications if your project has an app, community fora such as a panel of experts speaking on a topic of specialization, online surveys, phone interviews, door-to-door interviews, feedback forms, in-person interviews, focus groups, and citizen panels or assemblies. In this lecture, we have gone over the stakeholder engagement process. Remember, the purpose for this engagement is to identify relevant stakeholders, facilitate rights holder involvement and input throughout the project, identify and safeguard equities, and establish revisitation and evaluation cadence. The process includes 4 steps: evaluating stakeholder salience, performing a positionality exercise, determining levels of engagement, and establishing engagement methods. There are a number of questions here to help you to evaluate salience. I'm not going to read through those again here. Remember that positionality, as far as a definition, is the social and political context that creates your identity and influences your understanding of the world. When we were looking at the positionality exercise, you'll remember there were 4 categories. I won't go over those 4 categories here, but the positionality exercise identifies how those categories represent sources of power and advantage or sources of marginalization and disadvantage. Once you've looked through that visualization, if you're doing this on your own, you would then engage in a positionality reflection. And again, here are the main questions. I won't read through those here. You then want to determine the engagement level. This includes defining clear and explicit participation objectives. Remember the 4-tiered chart that we saw with empower at the top, then partner, consult, and inform. Finally, you want to establish engagement methods. These are means of evaluation and accommodating stakeholder needs. Practical considerations include resources, capacities, timeframes, and logistics. And finally, there were a number of different engagement methods that we looked at. Those are included again here for your reference.